The invisible threads of child neglect are often skillfully woven into the fabric of everyday life, lurking in seemingly innocuous gestures, in the growing silence and moments of absence that are easily overlooked. The crux of the problem is not what is present, but what is desperately missing. It would seem that what can happen if one day you don't ask, "How was your day?" or give a hug in a moment of need. But for a little person, these gaps become not just a void, but an echo that will resound throughout his life, shaping his perception of the world and himself in it. Let's imagine fertile soil in a garden. When we carefully tend it, it blooms with a riot of color, even if the seeds sown seem fragile and delicate. But what happens if we leave that soil without moisture and attention? The roots may survive, but the growth will be distorted, and the emerging shoots will bear the stamp of that lack in every twisted leaf, a reminder of the neglect experienced. In the same way, the lack of proper care for children undermines the very basis of their development, and what grows on this soil bears forever the imprint of what was never there, but was so necessary for full growth. Emotional loneliness rarely manifests itself in screaming or open violence. It prefers to hide in routine, in indifferent glances that are never met, in unspoken words that could have been a bridge to understanding and intimacy. This is a quiet but destructive process, the consequences of which can be much deeper and longer-lasting than from the loudest scandals. And only careful observation and sensitivity can help to notice these hidden signs in time and prevent tragedy. When the father is present in the child's life only formally, remaining emotionally detached and not showing proper attention and support, it poses a serious challenge to the child in the process of forming his self-awareness. How can a young soul learn to understand its own feelings and emotions if the closest people, who are supposed to be the first mirrors, do not reflect love and acceptance? Scientific studies convincingly show that children who have grown up with emotionally unavailable parents often have difficulty recognizing and accepting their own feelings, as well as building healthy and harmonious relationships with others. In such circumstances, children often internalize survival strategies such as hiding their true emotions, suppressing their voices, and sadly, even placing the blame for their lack of attention on themselves. Paradoxically, neglect often goes unnoticed precisely because of its quiet nature. But could it be that it is what escapes our gaze that leaves the deepest and most indelible mark on our psyche? Consider a concrete example from life. Imagine a child who proudly brings his drawing to his parents, hoping for praise and approval. However, in response, he faces indifference and lack of attention. At this point, the child not only feels the acute pain of being ignored, but also begins to internalize the destructive idea that his or her art, and perhaps himself or herself, has no value. Over time, this child may grow into a person who shuns all forms of self-expression. He will subconsciously believe that everything he does or says is unimportant and not worthy of attention. Thus, emotional neglect in childhood can lead to long-term negative consequences that affect self-esteem, self-confidence, and the ability to build fulfilling relationships. Have you ever thought about how fleeting events can shape the beliefs we carry through life? Neglect, like a silent but powerful root, reaches deep into the mind, intertwining with everyday experiences and defining a child's idea of what he or she deserves from the world. The tragedy of the situation is that often this neglect is not intentional, but a side effect of the very pain and confusion from which the child should have been protected and supported. This brings us to a key question. How is this early soul emptiness reflected in the minds and hearts of children as they become adults? This is where we begin to realize the depth of the problem. It is not just about what was not given, but how that absence becomes a distorting prism through which the rest of life is viewed. Next, we will look at the psychological consequences of such neglect, exploring how these invisible roots turn into shadows that shape people's destinies, often irreversibly. When we talk about the impact of childhood neglect on psychological development, we enter a complex territory where lack of attention and support becomes an invisible barrier that a person carries with him or her throughout life. Raising a child in an environment of neglect is akin to building a house on an unstable foundation. Even if at first glance everything seems to be in order, over time, defects are bound to appear, calling into question the reliability and safety of the entire structure. The child's mind has an amazing ability to adapt like a malleable clay, taking shape under the influence of life circumstances. However, when a child's needs are neglected, the consequences can be extremely negative. Deprived of the necessary support and recognition, the child begins to form an idea of himself based on what he lacks. Unanswered questions arise in his mind. Do I matter? Is there someone who cares about me? Do I deserve love? These unresolved doubts create an inner emptiness that will be very difficult to fill later on. From a neurobiological perspective, neglect has a profound effect on the developing brain. Scientific studies demonstrate that children who experience neglect have elevated levels of cortisol, a stress hormone. Chronic exposure to cortisol can damage the areas of the brain responsible for emotion regulation, memory, and learning ability, negatively impacting a person's mental and emotional well-being in the long run. Ignoring a child's needs leaves a deep mark not only on their soul, but also on their perception of reality. A child's brain, like a sentry on watch, is constantly scanning the space, waiting for a catch or a new dose of frustration. To better understand this, you can paint a picture in your imagination. A child grows up in an atmosphere where there is no place for comfort or emotional security. Every timid attempt to find support, whether it is a plea for help or tenderness, encounters a wall of indifference or receives a painful rejection. And then, gradually, the child learns a bitter lesson. Do not expect good from others. He builds impregnable bastions around his heart, slams the doors to his inner world, and goes into voluntary confinement. Now let's imagine that this little sufferer has grown up and is trying to build a strong, trusting relationship. How can one open up to another person if those who by birthright were supposed to be a support and protection betrayed him from the very beginning? Unfortunately, such stories are not that rare. But do we fully realize the devastating effect they have on a person's life? And what about the behavioral patterns that form in response to neglect? Some children, faced with coldness and alienation, choose the path of hyper-independence, as if challenging the whole world. I am my own boss. I don't need anyone else. In contrast, there are people who have a strong need for approval from others, seeking to fill the emotional vacuum created by a lack of attention and care in childhood. Which of these scenarios seems more recognizable? Is it possible that everyone, to some degree, carries elements of their childhood experiences into their everyday interactions with the world? The psychological consequences of childhood neglect affect not only the individual, but also society as a whole, shaping an entire generation of people who must grapple with deep-seated feelings of inferiority and rejection. Yet in this complex process, something truly human is revealed: the remarkable ability to see light through the darkness and to strive for healing. This fact leads to a key question: how can symbols and narratives help to further understand this emotional journey? The following will explore how art, in its deepest and most sincere manifestations, serves as a mirror reflecting trauma, while also being a powerful tool for deciphering the echoes of experienced neglect. Art has the unique power to convey feelings and experiences that are often impossible to express with ordinary words. In the short film Opal, every element, from symbolism to sound, becomes a bridge to the hidden feelings of trauma. This film uses a visual and sensual language that penetrates deep into the viewer's soul and invites exploration into the darkest and most hidden corners of the human consciousness. It begs the question, why does art so powerfully convey the effects of neglect? And what does it say about aspects of reality that many people prefer to bypass? The Opal script is a prime example of how layered meanings are created through aesthetics and symbols. The overstuffed, depressing house, populated by characters consumed by their passions and obsessions, appears not just as a place of action, but as a direct reflection of a fractured consciousness. The blind grandfather, lost in his world, becomes a metaphor for self-destruction, and the mirror becomes a tool for the father to seek constant confirmation of his own importance. However, the mirror symbolizes something much more: the lack of true reflection, the feeling of not being seen or acknowledged. Isn't this reminiscent of the situation where each of us, like the father, adjusts the mirrors of our lives to avoid facing the unpleasant truth? Like Claire, the heroine desperate to see the true reflection of herself in the mirror, each of us sometimes seeks validation of our significance. The symbolism that permeates her story is like a game of contrasts, where soothing and disturbing notes intertwine to reflect the duality of emotional experience. The melodic and upbeat music, meant to be a refuge, often only masks the dysfunction deeply rooted in her life. This begs the question, how often does the outer shell, whether it be carefully chosen words, gestures, or enchanting melodies, conceal the deepest pain and suffering? Are we able to hear more than what we want to hear? Or can we pick up the discordant notes of truth behind the facade of well-being? The contrast between the two houses presented in the short film becomes a particularly striking emphasis in the narrative. The fictional, light-filled, idealized house is Claire's mental refuge of sorts, a place where she can create the illusion of love and acceptance. While the real house, steeped in darkness and chaos, is a metaphorical reflection of the harsh reality of her existence. This stark contrast makes the viewer wonder, how often do we erect imaginary houses in our imagination to escape the painful realities of the present? And to what extent do these illusions, on the one hand, help us to survive, and on the other hand, lure us into an endless cycle of denial, preventing us from facing the truth? Art, as Opal demonstrates, has a dual function. It not only serves as a mirror reflecting painful experiences, but also as a kind of bridge to help us overcome them. It provides the tools to face hidden fears and to give voice to those who have been silenced for a long time. But the question arises, is it enough to simply be an observer and analyze these stories? Next, we will look at how traumatic events and neglect perpetuate themselves, forming vicious circles that sometimes seem inevitable. It is important to realize that recognizing a problem is only the first step in addressing and transforming it. Childhood neglect trauma is not an isolated phenomenon, but a recurring scenario, an invisible stream that cuts across generations and influences the formation of behaviors, beliefs, and interpersonal relationships. This process can be compared to a stone thrown into water. The circles diverging from the point of impact affect not only the point of force, but also the entire environment. The initial lack of attention and care in childhood can transform into persistent behavioral patterns that perpetuate a sense of inner emptiness, like an unwanted emotional inheritance. A child raised in neglect often carries the echoes of this abandonment into adulthood, unconsciously reproducing the very behaviors that once caused him or her pain. An under-recognized mother may have difficulty expressing appreciation to her children. A father whose childhood was spent in an atmosphere of emotional coldness may find it difficult to show warm feelings. Thus, a vicious circle is formed, passed down from generation to generation. But is this repetition of the scenario predetermined? Or is there a possibility to interrupt this chain? Scientific research sheds light on the reasons why it is so difficult to change ingrained behavioral patterns. The human brain, especially at an early age, has an amazing ability to adapt to its environment. If neglect prevails in that environment, survival strategies such as avoiding conflict or downplaying one's own needs become automatic reactions. These behaviors, once useful for coping with painful experiences, eventually become obstacles to living fully in the present. For example, a person who has internalized distrust as a way of self-protection may find it extremely difficult to build close and trusting relationships. How many of us still carry around defense mechanisms that are no longer useful, but which we can't seem to get rid of? It is precisely such complex intertwining of the past and present that we see in the fates of many people. Ancestors, parents, were not born careless. At some point in their life's journey, they too have encountered circumstances that triggered a chain of consequences that make us wonder, how is it possible to break these persistent patterns of behavior if they are so firmly embedded in our nature? A concrete example is the concept of parentalization, where a child is forced to assume the role of a parent, breaking the traditional distribution of roles in the family. In the short film, Claire embodies this phenomenon. She is used to compensate for the emotional vacuum created by her parents. In the long run, this can lead to the formation of adults burdened with an overwhelming load of responsibility that they should never have had to carry. Have you ever wondered how many unnecessary obligations we take on just because we haven't learned to let go of what doesn't belong to us? However, the persistence of traumatic experiences is not a final verdict. There are examples of people who have been able to break the cycle by transforming their pain into a valuable lesson and their lack of attention and care into a source of empathy and compassion for others. Recognizing patterns of behavior that harm us is the first step toward change, opening the door to choosing a different, healthier path. True personal transformation requires considerable courage, significant time commitment, and often skilled outside help. This difficult task of breaking the cycle of negative experiences naturally leads to a key question: what lies ahead? How can we achieve healing and reconnect with ourselves after years of neglect? In further analysis, like the reflections of an eternal city, there is hope for rebirth and a new understanding of what it means to care and to be a worthy object of care. For ultimately, healing represents equally an act of courage and an act of self-love. Even in the most impenetrable darkness of chaos, hope is like a sprout breaking through seemingly barren soil. Even after a long period of neglect, there is still something in man that longs for the light, longs to break the cycle and find the long-awaited healing. However, the path to recovery and return to a full life is not straightforward, and it begins with the realization of the need to recognize the problem, because it is impossible to fix what is denied. Claire, like an opal, symbolizes this internal struggle. Her life is a constant torn between oppressive ideals and the harsh reality faced by many who have experienced neglect. So how do we begin to heal the wounds that are so deeply rooted that they seem to be an integral part of identity? The initial step on the road to recovery is to realize that the trauma experienced is just an episode in the drama of life, not a predetermining scenario for the rest of one's destiny. An important step on this path is the concept of re-education, which involves making up for the lack of care and acceptance that, for one reason or another, was not received from parents in the past. This process can be expressed even in simple acts, such as looking in the mirror with a sincere affirmation, "I see you, and you are worthy of the best." Such expressions of self-compassion have an amazing power to transform deeply held beliefs and perceptions of self. This path does not promise to be easy, but it is absolutely essential to achieving inner harmony and wholeness. In this context, it is helpful to ask yourself, what words of support and comfort would be addressed to the child you once were? In addition, external support plays an invaluable role in the healing process. Skilled therapists, support groups, and even sincere friendships can be reliable guides and beacons for those who have braved the rough waters of recovery. Genuine human connection, based on empathy, can fill the voids created by experiences of neglect and rejection. However, establishing such a connection requires a certain vulnerability, openness, and willingness to share one's experiences, which can be difficult after years of self-protection and secrecy. It is important to learn to recognize those who are truly supportive and understanding from those who may cause more pain. The soul wounds inflicted by neglect can leave an indelible mark, but they do not have the power to predetermine who we are. Any effort to heal is a conscious decision to let go of the burdens of the past and become the creator of what is to come. Let us remember the wise words of Viktor Frankl. When circumstances are overwhelming, transformation begins with ourselves. Experiencing trauma is certainly part of personal history, but it should never limit potential and possibilities. It is important to remember that even in the most unfavorable circumstances, life finds ways to thrive. The question is, how do we manage the priceless gift we carry within us? We invite you to share your thoughts and ideas in the comments. Perhaps your experience will be the starting point for someone else's life-changing transformation. Thank you for your attention, and see you in the next chapter of this fascinating journey.